You will find us here mighty. You will find us here divine. You will find us where you left us, not as you left us. The poem is from a statue that serves as an invocation for the city of center of peace and justice that's in Alabama. As this memorial reflects on the evolution of racism and how it's influenced Black and brown bodies as from being healthy, alive, and successful as their counterparts, I reflect on the essential importance of reminding our Black and brown youth of their worth, their strength, and their resiliency in their lineage, and to work to enhance the wellness of their legacy. So basically what I'm trying to say is youth of color deserve healing too. Currently and historically, youth of color are disproportionately crippled by discrimination and biases within the system they are forced to subside in, while surviving the ramifications of poverty, racism, violence, and just all the lasting effects of slavery. I observed that because of the systematic presence of racism, institutionalized biases, discrimination, and other things, youth of color not only experience disproportionate disparities within education, within health, within the criminal justice system, or develop of social intelligence, but they lack self-efficacy, that natural grit to say that they're able to overcome and achieve anything that they are setting their minds to. This psychological damage that has stemmed back from the transatlantic slave trade, or even further, the founding of our native grounds, has taught that Black and brown populations are inferior to their white system and only useful for the white system's purposes, not exactly what they were truly created for. As the opening poem supports that I shared with you, I want to remind youth of color. You, we were created for better. I want youth of color to endeavor in building self-efficacy and healing in order to collectively, not just singly, but collectively address institutionalized biases and create success for all. And I want the supporting white population working with youth of color, and even those who aren't, to actively participate in self-reflection and challenging their contribution to the systematic racism in order to dismantle disparities and perpetuated trauma. I know it's a mouthful, but hopefully my personal story to help you understand. So I recently visited Skid Row twice during my last endeavors to Los Angeles. During the second visit, a resident was open to conversation with me. He currently lived there. I asked if he feels that the city is helping him go towards the life that he deserves through resources or outreach and things like that. And he replied, "This is the life I deserve. This is home." Now, I recognize that I have no place to determine what's best for anyone in this world. Yet, I do want the opportunity to expose the options to choose better. My lineage comes from Skid Row, so as I understand, it was home for me too. Yet, I am grateful that someone showed my father the option to choose differently, whether it was better for him or not. With history of trauma, addiction, and health, I mirror that difficult choice every single day. And I know so many more people of color who have such a similar story. They deserve healing too. I want to bring recognition to the high collateral ramifications of these historical occurrences, specifically towards the perpetuation of trauma and the lack of understanding that this unhandled trauma causes such a large margin of wellness and success between youth of color and white youth. I seek to educate youth on these very things happening before their eyes and remind them of the efficacy and resilience that they possess and that is within them for them to become who they were designed to be. Now, I want to share some statistics with you because it just makes this phenomenon even more alarming. And it allows me to tell you a brighter story. So, 2 out of 10 youth have experienced psychological, social, emotional, or behavior problems. Out of those youth, 8 out of 10 of them are youth of color or poor. 5 out of 10 of youth have experienced some form of in or out of school suspension. This is youth of color again, starting in kindergarten, yet they only represent 19% of the demographics. And lastly, 6.5 out of 10 youth believe that their race, or sorry, their 6 out of 10 youth of color believe that their race strongly or slightly affects or limits their success. So there's so much evidence to show that youth of color are aware of how this truly affects them, how the system is disproportionately set up for them. And instead of figuring out how to combat it, they've internalized it and said, this is how my life is supposed to be. So for example, going into adulthood, 4 out of 10 adults of color will experience lifelong PTSD symptoms. But because of cultural stigma, social stigma, or just lack of necessity, less than half will actually forego seeking treatment and endure in this detriment of wellness and health. 4 out of 10 adults of color also have reported experienced symptoms of anxiety, depression, and trauma in response to this historical trauma, racism, and microaggressions that happen in the workplace or just in other settings. Yet, only 2 out of 10 actually seek therapeutic intervention. Lastly, it's shown in research that parents of color are less likely than white parents to plan for their children to go to college. So again, bringing all these statistics together, there's this mindset, right? There's this ideology that because the system has shown youth of color that they don't deserve better, they believe it. And they grow up as adults to continue to believe that they don't deserve better, and they live in it and they die in it. So in basic terms, youth of color can't do better because they're taught that they don't deserve better. And the systems that's made to help these youth of color are the main ones that's telling them to be destroyed. How ethical is that? So I worked at a juvenile law clinic, and I was the clinical social worker. And I had to defend kids who were about to be put in a juvenile detention center based on what they did and show that they have any type of mental illness or things like that involved. And so there was one child who he is experiencing his mother shot in front of his face, been introduced to drugs and violence and whatnot, and he did a criminal act. And when we talked to him about the trauma that he's endured, asking, does he know what trauma is? Does he know what PTSD is? He looked at me and he said, I don't think that's trauma. This is my life. And so again, there's this normalization that this is how their outcome is supposed to be. And I really want to show youth of color that we deserve healing too. Originally, I was so passionate about addressing the system that will treat the youth of color with empathy and with understanding of their trauma-filled experiences, and to help close that gap. Since they are the ones that give the resources and intervene with this population, I feel like that was the place to go. But now, I see it so differently, especially from exploring historical literature, historical art, going to museums, looking at things historically from Black and brown populations. I realized it's so much more rewarding to the population of reminding the youth of color who they are descendants of and who they have the power to be. It is rewarding to support youth in building their own self-efficacy, their own self-awareness, and their own intelligence for their own resources to address their own traumas, as well as empowering their community to take the same action in healing. And by creating programs and initiatives that focus on addressing that within the youth to sustain themselves, instead of giving them unsustainable resources from the system that already broke them in the first place, that's liberating in itself, right? That's true freedom. That's true healing. And I want to support the empowerment and helping youth become and build the future they've always aspired. Let's turn those statistics into successes with integrity and intentionality. So now I just want to ask you, what will you do to recognize what our youth of color have endured? We tried pity. That's not the answer. Shame's not the answer. Avoiding the conversation is definitely not the answer. But I'm asking you to take a look at yourself and your biases, your actions, your phrases, your friend groups, your churches, your places that you work out, the places that you go to grocery shop, and your place of work. Ask yourself, am I contributing to the dangerous biases that have negatively impacted youth of color? Am I giving money to businesses who support incarceration of populations of youth of color? Am I calling Black kids thugs because that's what I'm used to seeing and hearing? Am I saying that youth of color look like doctors instead of saying that they always look like ball players? We must recognize, whether people of color or white people, that we have a role in this issue, and we must confront what that role is. We must offer reparations when there is needed. We must empower our youth of color. We must hear and listen. We must see and be seen. And we must remember that we can no longer allow youth of color to be lost in the system. So here you endure and are luminous. You are not lost to us. The wind carries sorrows, sighs, and shouts. The wind brings everything. Nothing is lost. Thank you.